first, let me say this. Thank you
Mm.
for being on the podcast. I really
Oh
appreciate
yeah.
it. Yeah, I was thinking about guest speakers to be on the podcast, and you're definitely one of those people that came to mind. And also Jonathan, I'm going to reach out to
Mm.
him
Yeah.
because I really want him to be on the podcast too.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Just excuse me, I'm sick, so that's why.
I was like, I
Are you
have
sick too?
coffee. No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no. I have coffee. I took your. This is like people having a cup of coffee. Seriously.
Yes, yes, I love it. Yeah. I'm kind of sick. I don't know what happened.
Mm.
It just yesterday it just hit me out of nowhere. Like I don't
Mm.
know whether it's the season changing or I don't know. I don't know what happened.
Hmm.
So anyways, that's why I sound congested. So
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
No worries.
So this was actually our introduction.
Hmm.
You and I, Lemmy was the one that
Hmm.
introduced us,
Hmm. Yeah.
and I had heard about the Diaspora Network when I came
Hmm.
to Austin for the first time,
Hmm. Yeah.
and I wanted to know and hear more about it. And then I met you and Jonathan,
Hmm.
which was wonderful, and I got to hear what you guys are doing, not just here in Austin but also in Phoenix as well. I also know a few people from Phoenix that have attended your guys' events, and
Hmm.
have told me. One of them being Emmanuel told me
Mm.
about yeah, and so it was nice to hear that there was, I guess, a people that are really about the next generation, empowering the next generation, but just
Hmm.
more generally about, how can we unite churches,
Right.
which to me is very attractive and
Hmm.
something I am pulled towards too, because I'm all about unity. And
Hmm.
so before we get into um, you know what you are doing in the
Hmm.
Diaspora Network, I actually want people to get some context about you personally. And so if you're
Okay.
willing, I would love to hear your story about kind of your upbringing,
Hmm.
how you kind of met the Lord, and then
Hmm.
how you got involved into the Diaspora Network, and then we'll just kind of start from there.
Yeah.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
Totally.
cool.
Yeah. So, um, I was born in the Philippines first, in like sort of the Metro Manila area.
Mm,
And I grew up there until I was 6 years old, and my older sister is seven. Um, but our birth dad had passed away when we were really young, so I don't really have much
mm,
memories about him. So our
mm,
birth mom, who we call Mama, Eden, she was raising us on her own, but on her own is also relative in a very communal culture. There was like a village surrounding us of
mm,
grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, cousins, and all of that. And so it was like my sister, me, and then our younger brother, Emil. But around that time that our birth dad passed away very suddenly, and of course that just like radically changed, my family's trajectory.
mm.
We because the conversation was actually we were going to move to Canada, apparently, and
Really?
so yeah,
Wow.
I mean, I know we had talked before. There's a really large Filipino community in Canada. My birth dad had family in Canada,
Mm, mm,
but my mom's sister, so my maternal aunt, so
mm,
she's Filipino, and her husband, my adopted dad, he's white American. They started talking about what it would be like to adopt my older sister and I to sort of just like help with
mm,
um, just like like the financial pressures and everything like that, to be able to assist our family.
mm,
So adoption, takes a while to kick through. But particularly because it was an in family adoption, it was good to be able to know like our relatives and stuff. So
mm,
we came here December 2003. Um, for people who have lived in a tropical climate their whole life, coming to North Texas in December was like, this is the Arctic tundra. Why is it so cold? Had
Yeah.
no
Wow.
concept. Yeah, no
Yeah.
concept for anything above, 85 degrees and 100% humidity.
You're
um,
blessed.
yes, yeah. Yeah, I didn't actually know what a tundra was like until
Yeah.
y'all are, in Canada.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, so my sister and I grew up here in the Fort Worth area where I am right now at my parents' house,
Mm,
from, six until we went off to college. And unlike maybe like the cities like Houston or even like the coastal cities, like LA and San Francisco, there wasn't like an established like Filipino ethnic enclave here. And the
mm,
Filipinos that my mom had met and known and built these relationships with, we call them aunties, uncles, and stuff like that.
yeah.
But they weren't blood relatives. They were just sort of like spread across the North Texas area. And that
Mm,
was really how I think, in a lot of ways, we kept in touch with our Filipino culture.
mm,
Because, when we went to school, at the school we went to, the elementary school was like predominantly white. And
mm,
so it was very early on, you get the sense of like otherness. And I always tell people I didn't realize that I was Asian until I came to America because I was always just Filipino.
yeah. Wow.
Uh, yeah. And then when you fill out like sort of like standardized tests or whatever, and it's like asking for your race, at least here in America,
Yes.
I had like an identity crisis. Is it Pacific Islander? Is it Asian?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Philippines is in
Yeah.
the Pacific. And even asking my mom,
Mm,
and she's like, "Oh, we're Filipino, so just choose one of
mm,
them." But yeah, it was just interesting growing up, like in the South, for one thing, in the American South, which has a very interesting history with regards to like immigrants, race, things like that.
yes.
Um, but also being raised in a bicultural, biracial household. My dad is a military man, and so
Mm,
having
mm,
that side, and then my mom, uh, in many ways, having what we would think of as like Asian mom, sort of
yes.
characteristics, and the pressure to assimilate in lots of ways was like really strong because not that people were, I think, like verbally forcing us to be like, you have to become white or whatever that means,
Mm,
but just this
mm,
idea of, oh, the things that I like are considered weird or not okay.
mm,
Or as like a preteen or teenager, like this desire to fit in. And
mm,
so that meant, that the person who I was, I think it felt like it was intention with wanting to
mm.
maintain those Filipino roots. And so for a while, I quit speaking our language. Um,
Wow.
yeah, mostly because, um, I mean, and you might know and recognize this, but when you flip languages, sometimes the accent remains.
That's
Um,
right.
And I would get teased by both my family in the Philippines when we would have like Skype calls and stuff with them, and, classmates if I had been speaking Tagalog with my family. Sometimes I'd speak English funny. And
Mm,
then my family in the Philippines, when I would speak Tagalog to them, and I think it was good natured, but I felt very self conscious at that time.
mm,
They would tease me. They're like, "Oh, you're becoming so American. Like, you sound
mm.
weird." And I just didn't know
Wow.
how to deal with that tension, so I just
So
quit speaking the language.
so on both sides,
Yeah,
you were kind of just in a way ridiculed, trying
yeah,
to speak English but had a Filipino
hmm,
accent. Trying to
yeah,
speak Filipino, you have a American accent.
yeah.
Wow.
And
Mm,
and I think that's the thing is like most people who said that probably didn't realize the impact,
mm-hmm,
of their
mm,
words and the ways that others' perspectives forms us and how we perceive ourselves.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so that had a big impact, and it really wasn't until, well, I would still like cherry pick aspects of Filipino culture that I felt like were acceptable, like the food. Oh,
Mm,
people like the food. Boxing, we have Manny Pacquiao and all these things that I felt like were more socially acceptable, whatever that means, forms of being Filipino.
sorry to
And it
interrupt.
really,
What's
yeah.
boxing?
Yeah. So
Like,
boxing as in like punching, like the
oh,
sport.
like the sport boxing. Okay,
Like,
okay.
yeah, not like Boxing Day in
Okay,
Canada.
got you. I
Yeah,
wanted
like the actual,
clarification.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, like boxing the sport is like a very big deal
Mm.
in the Philippines.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah, so those things that I just felt like, oh, this is cool. People can more easily ingest this.
Mm,
But even family members would like tell us, you're American, you're not Filipino. So
mm,
act like an American, whatever that
mm,
means, really. And it wasn't until college that one, I started learning sort of more about like the history of like how the Philippines in many ways came to be, the
mm,
the forces that have shaped, like the world stage. And I started getting really angry about a lot of things. It feels like, oh, the histories that I learned growing up was very one-sided, and I didn't actually consider how this would harm, my people and all these things like that. And so it took a while, even like for my sister talking to me and being like, hey, I'm so glad that you are learning these things and that you're able to educate people. But like I sense this like anger, like this rage sort of
mm,
rising up in you. Like about like Americans and all these sorts of things. And it took her really saying that to me for me to be able to check myself, and realize, okay, I think underneath this anger is just like a sadness as well, feeling out of touch with the history of my people, or assuming that
mm,
the European powers that came here were only doing good and all of
mm,
that. And, amid all of this, I was also struggling like faith wise. And it wasn't until college that it felt like I really just encountered expressions of like the Christian faith that I felt like this is something that I can hold on to, that is
mm,
um, both my own, but also connected to like, church history. Because before that, my family in the Philippines is Roman Catholic. Um,
mm,
Yeah, and my dad here in the States, he was raised and attended the Christian Science Church. um,
mm. Wow.
yeah, so
Interesting.
yeah, there's a lot with that as well, but
Mm-hmm.
again, being Catholic, it was also like sort of difficult for us to, I think, get connected with the local Catholic community. In many ways, I was too young to like really understand what some of those dynamics were. But it
Mm,
was my best friend and her family, um, who started taking us to just like a non-denominational church down the road. And I remember the
mm,
first time I went to like kids church there. It's like, why is
mm,
everybody so happy and raising their hands? I don't
mm.
understand. Like, you
Yeah.
know. And so I got
Wow.
curious, yeah,
Mm,
and started growing more of like my knowledge of the
mm,
Bible and the
mm,
scriptures. Um, but in many ways, like the way I actually lived out my life contradicted a lot of, you know, those truths in the
mm,
scriptures.
mm,
Um, and just like a lot of pressure academically as well. Um, and just like circumstances surrounding my family at the time really like drove me to just like despair and what I can probably see now as like depression.
mm,
um, and the lovely fun thing called anxiety as well, particularly around
mm,
family expectations and stuff. And so I
mm,
just didn't really know where the Lord was and all of that. And I assumed,
mm,
if you're sovereign, if you're actually a good God, then I guess that means that you are letting these things happen to me.
mm.
And so, like maybe my life is just pointless and just going down that very, very dark hole of,
Wow.
like, is my life worth living at all? What if I just ended it? And those things like that. And the Lord has sent people in my life truly at like the exact moments that I needed it, who didn't know what I was going through, but it was almost like a prophetic,
Mm,
like a phone
mm,
call of like, hey,
mm,
I just felt like I had to call you right now. And the Lord is just like telling me to tell you that, you know, don't let darkness win, your life is meaningful, and just
Mm,
all these things. And I was like, okay, so I guess he does see me, and
wow.
um, yeah. So he's like ever since like those like encounters of just wanting to know more about this God who
Mm.
did see me in those moments of darkness and just growing even more in that throughout college. So,
How old were you when you were going through this?
oh gosh, it probably started as early as like sixth or seventh grade. Um,
Wow.
yeah,
So
and it's
early.
wild. It's wild when I see people now who are like in junior high. I'm like, oh my gosh, I was that young. Like they're
Mm,
babies. And I'm sure part of it is also like, the people I surrounded myself with, the media that I consumed on the down low,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that my parents may have not known about, and just like living the sort of double life. I'm sure
Mm,
exacerbated some of these things. It's like my choices were also part of, I think, what drove me into that.
yeah, that's right. I have a question for you. What made you
Hmm.
so angry when you entered into university and you started learning
Hmm.
about the history of
Hmm.
maybe the Philippines or American
Hmm.
culture? What
Yeah.
exactly was it that agitated you?
Hmm. Oh, that's a good question. Because even when I try to explain it to my family nowadays, it like it still doesn't like filter or sink in.
Yeah. Mm,
But I was writing this paper. It was like my senior seminar paper. And I wanted to write about Filipino American identity because I was really getting interested in this idea of like ethnic, national, racial identities, how that forms us, and how we see ourselves. And I was like, okay, well, I'd always been taught, um, that the Americans were liberators.
mm,
And they saved us from the Japanese, and, we're thankful for them. And America is like the good life. Like, this is the land of
mm,
opportunity. So that was like what I grew up thinking. Um, and also, I feel like I have to clarify this, even though I think it should be obvious of like, I still love being in this country. I'm so thankful for the opportunities that I have. But as I dug deeper into these histories, I was like, oh, so okay, so it was the Spanish who had us for over 300 years. And then America fought this war with Spain. And then Spain basically handed us to America, as like their lost territory.
mm,
And the Filipino people who thought that they would finally gain independence and freedom because the Americans presented themselves as allies. Um, of course they revolted because they were like, this is not what we were promised, and the American soldiers like ruthlessly cut them down. And their whole big thing was like sort of civilizing the Philippines. This idea that one of the presidents at the time, I don't know if it was like McKinley or something, but was, called us their little brown brothers. But
wow.
there was also a lot of rhetoric in America because, they didn't want to be part of a war, which is totally understandable as citizens of a country. But there was already a lot of anxieties around immigrants at that time, even then, of the Chinese that came before us and the Japanese, but like these Filipinos, they're like monkeys, they're like living in the jungle.
Wow. Mm,
And so these were the things that I was encountering. I was like, these are historical documents of what Americans at that time, thought of the Philippines. And like they gave us in many ways, they helped set up the educational system to where it is so that we have universities and, infrastructure, and those things are great. Um, but there was this sort of common, I think, thread as I was reading these of what seemed like a condescending or like paternalist sort of racism that I was perceiving of,
mm,
we know what's best for these people. And so we're not
mm,
going to let them rule themselves until we're sure that they're fit for it, And then, of course, that time didn't come immediately because then World War II started and the Americans had to leave. Um, and then eventually, like with the Pacific War, as it was like closing, the Americans were able to regain territory and things like that. And shortly after World War II, the Philippines was granted its independence. But even then, America sort of like built this relationship with the Philippines where we're still very dependent on them.
Mm, mm,
In many ways, it reminds me of, this is sort of like the closest comparison that I can make of, even though, you know, um, Britain let go of its colonies. In many ways, those colonies were still so dependent on Britain. They had no sort of like infrastructure or their own feet to like support themselves. So it was this like ongoing dependency on the
mm,
country. And again, as I was just like reading through government historical documents, of like one of the presidents, I think it was like Nixon at the time, was like,
mm.
yeah, we have to back, this guy Marcus, who ended up implementing martial law because he's like, we can't afford to lose the Philippines.
Sorry,
And
who's Marcus? I
yeah,
apologize.
Marcus. Yeah, no, it's okay. I'm talking about a lot of histories that I
No,
know.
this is really good.
So
Yeah.
yeah, Ferdinand Marcos. He was essentially like became a dictator in the Philippines. I think it started
Mm,
late 60s, maybe the very beginning of the 70s. But he was maybe a vice president or the president. No, he was the president at the time. And he said that, like communists are taking over the country. And for now, we're going to implement martial law so that we can like crack down on, these people who are trying to infiltrate our government and stuff like that.
mm,
Um, and then he just ended up holding on to power for decades. Um,
mm.
like journalism,
As a
free speech.
dictator in the
Yeah.
Philippines. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and like journalism, free speech, any political dissenters were killed or jailed or
Wow.
just disappeared. And and like in university, I was essentially finding out that like America kind of knew that this was going to happen in
Mm,
advance, or
mm,
they were backing Ferdinand Marcos because they didn't want this other person who was anti-American to, take control,
mm,
because then America would lose its foothold in the Philippines, and
mm,
there was still a
mm,
military presence there, and just all these things. I was like, this feels like the complete opposite of the history that I was told growing up. I was told that these people helped us and they've done nothing but good things for us.
mm,
And now I find out that, this particular government um, has had a history of propping up corrupt figures of power to serve their own needs. And that was
wow.
hard. That was really hard because one of the reasons why, my sister and I came to America and why our birth mom gave us up for adoption was this idea of like, America is the better country. America is the place where you want to be. You'll have opportunities there that you won't have in the Philippines, which is true. I've had so many more opportunities here in this country than even what my cousins who are well educated in the Philippines, but because of the economy and the government, they really struggle.
Mm,
Um, and so it just felt like this cognitive dissonance of like, what is this, things that I learned. And that's where I really really started getting angry as well, and about how Asians were treated in America, kind of lumped together and uh, perceived as like one monolithic group of people.
mm,
um, and yeah, it felt like the more I dug, the more this idea of what I thought um, about my family or our histories or whatever, like the more it got shaken up. So
mm. Cause you felt like it was all a lie.
I think so. Um, and I think part of it is I was also just becoming, in some ways, disillusioned about this idea that, like, America is God's country, and,
Mm,
this sort of like patriotism is, I don't think in itself bad, but when it becomes like nationalistic,
Nationalism.
like
Yeah.
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 And I think even then that had sort of like filtered down into my thoughts, even if I would have never called myself that.
Mm,
And so this idea that this, in a patriotic way, this nation that I do like love and care for, um, was in many ways behind some of the most horrendous things in my home country that
mm,
created these circumstances that trickled down to where, you know, we were living in like poverty or close to it. And I was
mm.
a few, many decades removed from that sort of thing, like when it was actually happening, but the downstream effects, right? Of,
Yes. Yes.
yeah. So,
Wow. No, that's you know, I think one of the things that really caught my attention when we were chatting over coffee for the
mm-hmm,
Diaspora Network blog,
mm-hmm,
you know, I kind of got to know you and kind of just hear your experience.
mm-hmm,
But I find that, not a lot of people know the history of America, including myself.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
I find, myself very fascinated when people
mm-hmm,
begin to talk about America or
mm-hmm,
even their influence in other
mm-hmm,
countries.
mm-hmm,
And, it really makes me start to think about, maybe their involvement in, because I was born in Canada. I wasn't born in Ethiopia.
mm-hmm,
So, you know, I don't know much of Ethiopian history either.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Until maybe just recently, where I started to hear stories from my parents, and
mm-hmm,
even their perspective on America, and Ethiopia, and the history that comes with that as well. Um, but I kind of want to pivot here
mm-hmm,
because earlier when you were talking about um, trying to find yourself, because you
mm-hmm,
you grew up in, obviously, the Philippines, you came to America,
mm-hmm,
and in a sense you were kind of struggling with your identity.
mm-hmm,
How Where are you now in terms of that?
mm-hmm,
And maybe what advice would you give to people, especially immigrants or
mm-hmm,
people who are, maybe born and raised from other countries, have come to America, or maybe they're born and raised here, but they have immigrant parents. Um,
mm-hmm,
what advice would you give them in terms
mm-hmm.
of finding their identity?
Yeah. No, thank you for asking that. It feels like that's a question that I've just been like, turning over
Wrestling
and
with?
over.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's going to be an ongoing thing in many ways.
sure.
Hopefully, by God's grace, I'll wrestle with it less, in my 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
Um, but that struggle in particular, I would say, was just saturated with shame. Um,
Mm,
and I don't know that I only recognized that really, I think, later of identifying that this was it. Um, there was this feeling of like indebtedness. Like there's a word for it in Tagalog called utang na loob, which means like there's this
mm,
idea of um, more than just owing someone something,
mm,
but it's like a sort of like an emotional like weight as well.
mm,
You're
mm,
in their debt,
mm,
and I had this like sense that, well, my family has sacrificed so much for me. I
mm,
have to pay them back. I have to do the best that I can because they've invested in me. And again, probably when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old, I'm not sure that I necessarily thought of the words investment. um,
yeah, yeah.
but it was just this like constant idea of I have to live up to what I think are the expectations that have been laid on me,
Mm,
which in many ways were verbalized, and there were some that you just kind of pick up like secondhand smoke of like maybe no one says this specifically, but they act in this way. And so you assume, oh, okay, I have to do that too. Um, but I think that's something that actually, as I meet more people from an immigrant background, not necessarily Filipino, but
Mm,
fellow Ethiopian friends, Honduran friends, all these things, this idea of we carry our parents' hopes and dreams. Um, and we're not sure if we're allowed to have our own, like differentiation, like that idea of
mm,
not like the hyper individualism, but this idea of I am part of my family, and you have these roots that go down, but I am
mm,
not my family in
mm,
the sense of like it's not my job
mm,
to carry all of that. And so as I grew older, as I really was able to identify these things, and particularly, mental health resources were like such a big part
mm,
of me
mm,
being able to name these things and actually asking the Lord, does he care about these aspects of my identity? Like, I get that he cares
mm,
about the spiritual things, but what about the stuff that's happening with my family, or the fact that I feel like if I fail this test, I'm going to have a massive argument with a parent, or, like,
yeah.
does he
Mm,
care?
mm,
Um, and I also just had like a lot of shame about the way that I looked. Because
mm,
like growing up as well in the Philippines, it was lighter skinned is better. Um,
mm,
this lighting doesn't
yeah.
show it right now, but it's like I'm much more tan than the rest of my
Yeah.
family.
Mm,
And so you were given like skin lighteners. You were told to eat certain foods
wow.
because it would make your skin light. You were told to stay out of the sun so you wouldn't get dark. So of course I tried to spite
Wow.
that by staying more in the sun.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, which is weird because in America people are like, "I love how tan you are. Is that
Yeah, yeah,
natural?" And I'm like
yeah,
so
yeah.
confused.
Mm,
But I thought what to be beautiful was like to be a brunette or blonde, to have light skin,
mm,
essentially to have white features because, even as you start getting crushes or, people start dating, you begin to be like, I think that these guys around me, like their type is this and not what I look like, short or
mm,
dark haired or
mm,
dark skinned. Um, and again, having that like sort of cultural influence of thinking that to be lighter skinned or lighter hair or whatever was better or more beautiful. Um,
mm,
I I struggled immensely with that. And again, of just like asking the Lord, do you care about, just my physical my physical struggle. And it was really learning in the last couple of years that like the Lord made our bodies.
yes.
We are embodied. And there's this one article that I even read a couple months ago that said when the Lord made Adam,
Mm,
it wasn't the spirit first and then he made Adam's body. He made Adam's body and then
mm,
breathed, life
mm,
into Adam. And we don't have a body, we are a body. um,
mm,
and so realizing that like he made these bodies, he calls it good. If he's sovereign, then that means he chose for me to be born in this body. And he thought that I was beautiful when he made me. And whatever sort of like cultural aspects there are, don't hold a candle to the creator of the
wow.
universe.
Wow.
Um, but like it's still a work in progress because even as I tell people that of I'm like a Filipino American
Mm,
Christian or something, I get some pushback of like, why do you say you're Filipino American? Why can't you just say you're a Christian, or that
mm,
that you go to church? um, and I've had that thing, I think is in Galatians, maybe. I know Paul wrote it, but it's like there's now no Jew or Gentile, um, this idea of color blindness, for lack of a better
yeah.
word.
Mm, mm,
um, and it's, again, really only been recently, particularly when I started working for a diaspora network, that I was like, in Revelation, it says every nation, every tribe, and every tongue. I was like, you can hear tongues. That
mm,
means that there are people of different languages there. And if
mm,
Jesus came back as a first century Jewish man,
mm,
like if he was still himself in that
mm,
body,
mm,
I don't know how we'll look like in glory, but I think that means I'll retain something of my ethnic identity. if he calls this body
Wow.
good, then he'll restore
Yeah.
it. And like, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be some disembodied angel, like,
Yes. Yes.
floating up there. And I've really been like, when I think about like what you said with like giving advice, to other people. I mean, one, if they don't know the Lord, I feel like I'd, start there and sharing the gospel, but also as we have those conversations of painting a more holistic picture of what it means to be a person living in this world. Like, of course, the soul is important. Of course, eternity is important. But I think there's been such a disconnect, even for those who are raised in immigrant churches, about what we're told of like, we're going to heaven, we're doing these things, because
Mm.
Jesus told us to. But like, does it actually matter or change my life here, me as a
Mm.
person connected in this family?
Mm.
Um, like addressing the things that weigh us down, like the shame, or perhaps um, the issues and concerns that people don't talk about because they're difficult and uncomfortable, and the rest of the family just sweeps it under the rug anyways. So why would I, shake the
Wow.
tree, of just like asking the Lord to like empower, to by his spirit to give you strength to be able to grow in wisdom, like about
Mm.
how to
Mm.
address these things, and getting around other believers truly. Probably ones around your age, just like,
Yeah.
to help
Yeah.
you like grow in that, but also those who are older, and who are wiser. And I know that can be hard, especially in immigrant churches, because it's like everybody knows your family, and if I ask them to
Yeah.
do it, what if it gets back to my parents?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but maybe it's not one of the elders at your church, but it might be another believer that your family knows that you can trust, because that was so foundational for me to start
Mm.
integrating like
Mm.
my immigrant identity, this 1.5 immigrant identity, with what does it mean to follow Jesus. Like, these are not separate
Wow.
things. Like, the
Wow.
Lord in his wisdom ordained these things to like go together, and that there's something about um the exiles in Babylon like idea that for those who have an immigrant heritage and always feeling kind of like, I don't really know that I belong. Um, that
Mm.
like scripture shows so many images of that, and like the Lord Jesus himself called, like, birds have nests and foxes have dens, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He wasn't
Mm.
accepted in his hometown. His disciples completely misunderstood what he came there to do. And so there's so much more to the story of the Bible. There's so much more to Jesus that can actually speak to the beauty of this immigrant identity,
Wow.
and what it means to follow Christ through that.
Oh, that is so good. You know, I always struggled with that idea. I
Mm-hmm.
always thought that I needed to be one or the other. But I think
Oh, yeah.
what really caught my attention, what right now, was that you said it's not one or the other. They integrate themselves in a way,
Mm-hmm.
and the Lord has to really give you wisdom on how to do that. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
maybe this is good to ask you because,
Mm-hmm.
and I know, we're all in process at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wanted to know what what are maybe the tools that you've been given or maybe have learned in your journey
Mm-hmm.
to integrate them, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so for example, is it a matter of understanding maybe certain values in your
Mm-hmm.
upbringing or in your culture or in your family that align
Mm-hmm.
with kingdom values,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and then in a way they kind of become integrated
Mm-hmm.
and cohesive.
Mm-hmm.
What so practical like practical tools
Mm-hmm.
on maybe how to integrate the two, because most people think I have to choose one or the other,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. and this is sort of like a caveat in terms of like how I process things, because at my heart, I'm still a scholar, a student.
I love it though. That's great.
Yeah.
We need
And
people like
so
that.
thank you. In many ways, I still live up here, and it's like a real work to make sure that things get down into here in the heart. But weirdly enough, it was learning more and more about Jesus's Jewish context that made me start thinking about this.
Mm,
Um, and I gave that caveat because like that can be a very heady thing to people of like, oh, I have to study Jesus, being Jewish.
mm,
But the way that started making connections for me is I was like, oh, right, he grew up in an honor shame culture.
mm,
Oh, right, family and the ways in which like intergenerational family structures and all these. Oh, right, Jesus actually really would understand that. Um, or
wow.
like these particular holidays that they celebrate, like, oh, that, like, I never thought about it that way. And so realizing that
Mm,
actually in many ways some of or aspects of the cultures from the East, which is such a big, non-West, I guess, um, some of those still bear a lot of similarities to just
mm,
like the life that Jesus lived, and the ways in which they thought about your family and saving face and your identity and
mm,
what's your parents'
mm,
reputation.
mm,
Um, and so for me, I was like, okay, if that's the thing, if this is like all actually fleshing out the person of Jesus even more, is there
mm,
more to this?
mm.
Um, and again, like it learning about Jesus's Jewish context is not for everyone.
Sure.
I think it's important to learn, but I know for some people that can be really hard. Um, but one of the things that has been so helpful to me is actually like reading um, like Christian books, either, like about the Trinity or how to live a faithful life or things like that,
Mm, mm,
by like deliberately reading it from non-white authors or non-American authors.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and this sounds like such a duh thing, but I remember the first time like I read a book from like a Chinese American or like 1.5, it was a Christian book. I
mm.
had this thought of like, I didn't know we could do that. Like I didn't know that, like I just assumed that
Yeah.
these books would be written by somebody named Jennifer or,
Sure. Sure.
something like that. And
Yeah.
not that those books are bad at all. Those are still just like, gifts to the kingdom, but actually deliberately seeking out these other perspectives, even if it makes us
Mm,
uncomfortable, even if people question,
mm.
like, why are you searching for a, a Christian book written by, an Ethiopian or somebody
Yeah,
from
yeah, yeah.
Malawi? And you're like,
Uh-huh.
well, they're still brothers and sisters. And I think the question I would ask is, why not? Why
Yeah, why
not
not?
look for those?
Mm,
Um,
mm.
and I mean, like in just numbers wise, the ones who get published most are the ones who come from like an American background anyway.
That's right.
So why
Yeah.
not support those other writers? But also, it's beautiful. It's so beautiful to be able to read how they encountered Jesus in, you know, Sri Lanka or India or Madagascar. And it's like, to me, really just putting myself in a place where I have to look up this information and sort of like expand what I think it means to be
Mm,
Christian outside of the bubble
mm,
that I grew up in.
mm, mm. Wow, that's really, really good. Um, you know, I think I think that oftentimes um, when it comes to children who are either 1.5 or 2.0,
Mm,
I think there is this deep-seated anxiety and weight
mm, yeah.
that they feel that they can't necessarily put language to. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and again, they live in this dichotomy, this tension of wanting to please,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's their parents, whether it's Christian truths or
Mm-hmm.
principles, or even, you know, their relationship with Jesus Christ, and also try to please the American culture that they're
Mm-hmm.
in, to gain that acceptance, um, you know, from the culture. And, you know, I think what I hear you saying is, I think young people need to get mentorship
Mm-hmm.
to get different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
because maybe this is not something that they
Mm-hmm.
pursue on their own, because they don't,
Mm-hmm.
maybe just out of ignorance, they don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Oh, for
um,
sure. Yeah.
and so I think it requires mentors. It requires
Mm-hmm.
people who are maybe older, wiser, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
have been through the same experience they're going through, to try to get a holistic view of their identity,
Mm-hmm.
and,
Yeah.
you know, pull from, whether it be books,
Mm-hmm.
from authors, from leaders who
Mm-hmm.
are non-American,
Mm-hmm.
and see how their perspective integrates within the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I just find it so powerful, Fatima, that you said they're not all separate, but
Mm-hmm.
they could actually integrate themselves together,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because, and there is a way to do that. There is a way to do
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, and so I think it's a matter of accepting the heritage, the background that you come from, and
Mm-hmm.
also the world that you live in today. And actually, this is
Mm-hmm.
a question for you, because, you know,
Mm-hmm.
earlier when you were talking about how, when you learned about American culture, and you know, uh, the connection with the Philippines, and, you know, learning about that made you angry. How
Mm-hmm.
did you have you reconciled it yet? Have you are you still angry about it? Or I guess is what is my question.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I find a connection, right? Especially when it comes to identity, and maybe learning about, you know, where you come from. You do live in America,
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, though your roots are from the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
are you still angry? Has there been
Mm-hmm.
reconciliation in that?
Mm.
How did you move forward?
Well, like my master's thesis was basically me trying to reconcile this, 100
Yes.
pages of me
Yes.
wrestling over and over
Mm.
again about like, what it means to be Filipino, to be American, and to be Texan. I don't know if you've noticed, but
Yeah.
Texans are
Yes.
very proud to be Texan. I'm
Very,
very proud to
very.
be Texan.
Yes.
Um,
And Christian, by the way, to add.
yes, and Christian, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like my master thesis was really the place where I wrestled with that again from like a heady place, but also I found
Mm-hmm.
myself crying as I would write my thesis,
Mm.
not just out of stress or exhaustion, but
Yeah.
out of like just like history, and the ways in which it works out or has worked out so that people either stay or move and all these things. And what I really came to this realization was I'm never going to find some perfect version of the Philippines that is untouched by, Spanish influence or American influence. Like,
Mm.
don't step in the same river twice. People change and shift. And so for me to think that there's some idealized version of this country's past that I could somehow discover, um, and was taken from us, like I'm not going to find that. Um,
Mm.
and that like the the wrestling that I have now is, I think, in some ways a sign of faith that I have in the Lord, that in the end, all these injustices that were recorded in history books, and even the ones who weren't, like through Jesus, if people came to Christ, they've been
Mm.
forgiven, or that at the end of the age, that the Lord Himself will answer those things.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and it,
Mm.
it doesn't erase the anger, but I don't think I'm necessarily like angry anymore. I think occasionally it'll like flare up, but
Mm.
I don't know that I'm living with that like state of just constant tension anymore of always being like, yeah, well, Americans are the worst or anything like that. I can't. I'm
Sure.
American. Like, even though I
Yeah.
came into this country from another one,
Uh-huh.
I have now also become part of the history
Mm, mm, mm,
over here. And like, this is now also part of my heritage. If I have children,
mm.
this is going to be part of their heritage.
Wow. Mm.
And so I think I was like, it's easy for me to be angry. That's like one of those like just bents that I have in
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
nature. But like under that anger was mostly like sadness, grief, a sense of
Yes.
loss
Yes.
for this home, that I had that I can't go back to, because even when I do go back in the Philippines, it's different than what I remembered. People
Mm, mm.
age, grow up, move houses. Um, and so to like just to wrap all that up, I still have those moments where I am certainly like I get angry when I maybe hear something that I think is just untrue or not the full picture about that complicated relationship that I just wrestled with in my thesis.
Mm, mm,
Um,
mm.
but it's really like it sounds sort of hokey, but it's just like it's true of like trusting the Lord. Like anytime
Yeah.
those things come up of just like, you know,
That's good.
am I
Mm.
am I level headed enough in this moment to address that the comment that somebody said? Can I challenge that graciously?
Mm, mm,
And
mm.
like if not, if I'm so angry of like being honest with the Lord of like, Lord, I'm angry that this is still happening. Like help me to work through that anger. Help me to
Yeah.
maybe like confess or to share that with somebody. Of just like I'm feeling angry about this, and to trust that again that wrong will be made right, that the
That's
light
right.
will shine
Mm.
through, and that I'm not just like some sort of passive background character, that if I'm part of this history now of being in this country, that it may not amount to, like Malala, but I
Sure.
can play my part to act justly, to speak the
That's so
truth,
good.
to
Mm.
maybe give an account of my family's histories, and how that's been shaped by American or Spanish influence, and just like do these small things. I like in Lord of the Rings, because that's like one of my favorite
Mm.
books and movies. There's this idea that like the big bad Sauron, he thinks that it's like the mighty deeds that shape the world, but it's really like the small acts of kindness, of love,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
that actually amount to changing the world. And I truly believe that, and that's something that Christ calls us to.
Oh, that is so good. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. I you know, and I think it's a righteous anger. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's not a an anger that leads to sin. I think
Mm-hmm.
it can be, and it
Yeah.
can turn into that.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think you it's it's a godly anger that
Mm-hmm.
I think God has put within you to
Mm-hmm.
express it in such a way that brings reconciliation with the goal
Mm-hmm.
of reconciliation. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, this is so beautiful because I think there's a lot of kids out there, especially for me, I deal with a lot of Ethiopian youth and young
Mm-hmm.
adults, and maybe they're angry at their parents
Mm-hmm.
um, because of whatever. It could be, the honor shame. It could be,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the parent wasn't emotionally there for them.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think this really encourages these kids because they have to accept their Ethiopian identity. That's what I'm just trying to
Mm-hmm.
get at here. They
Yeah.
have to accept that and get past the anger, or use the anger in such a way where they can reconcile you know their uh their upbringing and the way
Mm-hmm.
they grew up. And so
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of youth and young adults that could really benefit from this, and trust in
Mm-hmm.
God, like trust in the fact that God will make wrong things right.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness is key, and
Mm-hmm.
accepting who you are is so critical to God using you in the specific calling that he is,
Absolutely.
put you in, you know
Yeah.
and for you, it's a blessing, because I do know, I remember in our conversation over coffee, you talked
Hmm.
about how there were, correct me if I'm wrong, certain
Mm.
professors that just didn't, I guess, advocate for what you were,
Yeah.
going for. Can
Yeah.
you go a little bit into that?
Yeah.
Um, because I feel like, this is where God has put you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's important.
Yeah. Yeah, there were, I mean, going into the field that I went into, like particularly, I experienced some of it in undergrad, but it was really my master's where I think a lot of this was challenged. Like I was learning a lot of these like theories and things about
Mm-hmm.
nationality or race or ethnicity, and but I was the only believer in my entire cohort and department. There was
Mm-hmm.
12 of us.
Mm.
Um, and I was not just like the only Christian, but I felt like every time that I spoke about it, I was so terrified that I would just get arrows aimed at me
Yeah.
everywhere. And so I would, um, like, that was one of the other challenges was trying to, like, these things that I was learning that seemed in some ways antithetical to scripture, like as a whole perspective, but that there were nuggets in there that were actually helpful for understanding. Oh, this is, you know, somebody who's like a woman and an immigrant might experience a different thing from somebody who's like
Mm.
a woman and a non-immigrant. But even trying
Mm.
to talk to my professors about some of this, and they tried to remain neutral, I could tell, but me like um, advocating for certain things or talking about being a Christian in certain environments were just met with awkwardness or like, perhaps
Mm.
some skepticism. One professor in particular was talking about, because it was like a globalization class and was talking about mission trips and the way
Mm.
that mission trips were often just like this covert thing for the West to be able to like experience or get near like the seedy underbelly of a
Wow.
place and not actually doing anything to help. Uh, and it was truly the Holy Spirit that I didn't just explode in the middle
Yeah,
of
yeah,
class and be
yeah,
like, that is so biased. Like, are there absolutely like unrighteous like mission trips? Sure, like that happens if
Mm.
the leaders and the whole point of it is just misguided. But to paint this picture, um, especially in academia, that Christians are this like one note, one sided um,
Mm.
way of seeing the world. Like that's actually why I think it's so important for those of us who are followers of Jesus or and happen to maybe be in academics to show people that like the Christian faith for one is not weak. It actually has this long tradition of
Yes.
being extremely thoughtful and
Yes.
intelligent and engaging.
Absolutely.
And in many ways I just like let my life speak for itself, because if they were angry about like white
Mm.
Christians, they're going to turn to me and be like, okay, she's fed us, invited us into her home, is being kind to us.
Mm.
And she goes to a Baptist church and she's an
Mm-hmm.
immigrant. And so, like,
Yeah.
I'm just like, I sort of like let those aspects of my identity like speak for themselves.
So good.
Um, I'm just like living my life. Like, it is, of course, verbally important to share the gospel with somebody,
Of
but your
course.
life is
Yes.
also in
Yes.
many ways a sermon. Like, people pick up so much more from how you live and how you interact with them and just treating them as fellow image bearers, even if they're far from
Wow.
home.
Mm.
And like, it was actually really helpful. It was like a Tim Keller sermon that I heard at the beginning of grad school about like,
Mm.
um, the Israelites being exiled to Babylon and about like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach,
Mm.
and Abednego. And Daniel actually was this like bicultural bridge. He excelled in Babylon. I mean, it wasn't great because he was kind of forced to be there, but he still worshiped the Lord and he was still a man of integrity in Babylonian courts. And like, you know,
Wow.
even even though it
Mm.
cost him, he still followed his faith. And I think that's the other thing that I would, probably share is I don't want to like say that this is like easy or just like you can immediately do it. It's going to
Sure.
cost us something.
Of
Like
course.
Jesus said that it's going to cost you to live fully into this identity, to sacrifice it. Sometimes there are people who are not going to be down with that. You know, they're going to think that maybe you're either too woke or too conservative or like any of these words that kind of get thrown around. Um, but it's so worth it to live in
Mm.
just like the fullness of who Christ calls us to and who he calls us to be. And just to gain confidence
Yeah.
in that. Um, my sister in college, especially as I would like get nervous about these things or feel like, am I speaking out too much? She would
Yeah.
remind me, she would say, you have nothing to prove and only one to please.
So
And I would
good.
like, and I still cycle that like every time before I get up to speak of like, I should not fear man, but like the Lord
Wow.
is the one who I'm concerned with. And if he commands us to like live fully in these embodied, you know, experience that Jesus died for this in many ways. Like,
Yeah.
who am I to do anything less?
Yes.
So,
Incredible. It seems like there is a superior culture
mm-hmm,
for you,
mm,
that you live by. You know, you've accepted your identity in
mm-hmm,
being a Filipino, also accepted and reconciled, also being American, even though there's
mm-hmm.
still tension in that,
Yeah,
and being a
yeah,
Texan, as you mentioned.
yeah. Yes,
But
for sure.
which you know, I just moved here, you know, 2.5 months ago, and I hear you. I hear you when
Yeah,
it comes to
mm,
Texas culture. It's a different.
it's
It's very different.
crazy.
Yeah, it's very, very, very crazy. But despite, you know, all these, you know, uh, roots that you have a
Mm-hmm,
superior culture, and that's what I'm
mm-hmm.
hearing. It seems as
Yeah,
if the kingdom culture is
mm,
superior for you, and living by that actually helps you
mm-hmm.
to integrate into all these other cultures.
Truly, like I
Yeah.
have to remind myself to quit asking the question, am I being Filipino enough? Like I
So
think
good.
that question itself means I'm measuring myself according to what man thinks or what
Wow.
people think. Like I don't
Yeah.
have to prove this, even though sometimes the pressure is very strong and very like, you know,
Sure.
obviously I'm not even living this out completely consistently.
Yeah.
But to think like, am I being Ethiopian enough around my family or my
Mm,
friends, or am I representing my culture well? Like, what does that even mean? To ask these
mm.
questions, I think means we're going to make ourselves anxious, and living in such a way based on how people perceive us.
So good. I love it. We could go on and on about this.
Yeah.
Last question in
Hmm.
conclusion.
Yeah.
So I asked this to all my
Hmm.
guests,
Hmm.
and the question is, how do you, or what advice would you give to someone to make God known?
Mm. Ooh, that's such a good question. Um, I mean, like, this might just sound like really anticlimactic, but I'm like, just invite them into your life.
Mm,
Like, truly, if you're following Jesus faithfully, if you're part of a community or seeking one out, if you're rooted in a local church, um, just invite them in, treat them like normal people because they are
that's
just
good. Yeah.
regular
Don't be
people.
weird. Yeah.
Yeah, don't be weird. You know, you don't have to hyper spiritualize things. You don't have to live
Yes.
anxious, being like, do I need to share Jesus right now?
Yes.
Um, but to like make God known, I think like letting people see the everyday and how this kingdom culture saturates every aspect of your life.
Mm,
Because I truly think that the way in which we live, if we orient that around this idea that there's no separation between this is sacred and like this is secular, but like our entire life is now sacred. It has been set apart. And so to make God known is like, if I'm in Christ and I'm like inviting people into walking alongside me, getting to know me, then they're not going to have any choice but to see Christ. I
That's
truly
right.
think that. Like, I don't
Mm,
have to preach one single sermon and hope that that's the one that hits. It's just
mm,
like, oh, Fatima, why are you doing that? And it's like, oh, I just like in my faith as a Christian, or like, hey, my church teaches like English lesson, and all these things like that, or we do a lot of like community outreach and providing food for the poor, caring for the marginalized. And it's
mm.
not some like performance. It's just a normal thing, hopefully,
Yes.
for those of
Yes.
us who care about these things, and then inviting people to see that like Christianity, like true rootedness in Christ, is not like this weird, far off, ancient thing that is like completely
Mm,
disconnected from the reality of the world that we live in. It's actually like woven into the very fabric of our being. So to make God known, I think like let people into your homes, go on errands with them, like let the aroma of Christ sort of like
wow.
drift drift towards them until they can't help but be like, why, like, I know you're going through a hard time, but how are you still so
Mm,
encouraging or kind? Well, let me tell you,
yeah.
it's not treating people like projects. It's like becoming their friends and letting them see Christ
So
and the
good.
Holy Spirit in you. So
That is so good. I love that.
thanks.
That is so good. Because it just takes the weirdness out of it, like
Hmm.
I love that you said don't treat people like projects. I think as
Hmm.
Christians, sometimes we're
Hmm.
like, this person needs to get saved, so I need to strategize and
Hmm.
like we're gonna get them to hear. And it's
Hmm.
like, well, first and foremost, you're not the one who saves them. Christ does.
Amen. Yeah.
Yes. And
Hmm.
second off, they're not a project, they're people, they're humans.
Hmm.
And I just love the simplicity of that. Invite them into your life and
Hmm.
let your actions speak for itself. And
Hmm.
when conversations, the thumbs up keeps popping up, and I need to turn it
Yeah.
off because it needs to
Yeah.
go. It's been
Yeah.
interrupting my podcast lately. But anyways, it's like invite them in and
Hmm.
then let them see your life. And through that, questions will come up and you'll have doors
Hmm.
and opportunities to share the
Yeah.
gospel. I love it.
Yeah. I
It's
truly
so
think it.
good. Thank you,
Hmm.
Fatima. I appreciate you taking your time to chat and have a
Well,
conversation. Um, it felt like at the end there was just like a ribbon, just just the ribbon just got tied up on the box, and it's just like, here it is,
yeah.
people. This is it. So
Yeah.
thank you for
Thank
being
you.
on the podcast.
Oh,
Appreciate it.
it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you enjoyed that video. I want to give you guys a few reminders before you guys leave. Please subscribe, comment, and also like the video. The more engagement there is, the better. Second, if you want to be notified on when these videos come out, click the bell button on the top right-hand corner of the YouTube page. And lastly, if you want to check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please click the link down below in the description. Other than that, have a great day, guys. Ciao.